Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. We're currently batch recording our upcoming episodes, so I've asked some friends to take care of the podcast in a limited author takeover series. You'll recognize them as former guests on the show, so you'll be in good hands. I look forward to chatting again soon.
Hello, I am John James Minster, and I write horror stories. Thank you to Vicky and the Speculative Sandbox for inviting me to discuss a topic that's near and dear to me. By the way, love the Sandbox, and always a pleasure listening and watching the social media. Edgar Allan Poe is near and dear to me. I can't describe the influence that this greatest author of all time has had on me and my writing. I think it's best to let Poe speak for himself as to how influential that he was. Oddly, at the time when he was publishing and he worked as an editor, I think the most money he ever made was $50 for publishing one of his pieces. So his greatness really happened post-mortem. He had a pocket of fans in France, loud, vociferous, passionate fans out there advocating for him. And here in the U.S., he had contemporaries: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, who many were influenced by Poe, and they stole from Poe. They ripped him all the time. He was a brutal critic. That was part of his job, working for various publications, and probably made a lot of people angry, other writers, but they loved him nevertheless. It was Walt Whitman who showed up at his funeral eventually. His influence on, well, put it this way, there would be no modern detective novel without Poe. He invented that genre. Now, when I mention Poe to people, their immediate reaction is sort of cringe. He is known for some of the darkest horror short stories. He never wrote a novel. He wrote poems and short stories. That's what he published. And after the death of his wife, Virginia, that's when his writing, which prior to that was really just beautiful, it was all love. The man's soul was overflowing with creativity and love. But the true love of his life, Virginia Poe, his young bride, caught tuberculosis and died at the age of 24. And that's when the writing turned dark, when his spirit was so depressed and dark and crushed. They would find him sitting by her grave all night in the freezing cold. It really whacked him out, the death of Virginia. So I thought for this segment, just for folks who may be feeling that cringe factor and thereby avoiding Poe, I thought I would delve a little deeply and read my favorite short story by Poe. He referred to his bride. A lot of his writing was autobiographical in nature, and with his wife Virginia dying, he substituted her name in these stories. He protected her in death and not put her actual name. And The title of this story that I would like to read is Eleonora, published in 1850. And I just think it's beautiful, so let me read it. I am come of a race noted for vigor of fancy and ardor of passion. Men have called me mad, but the question is not yet settled, whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound, does not spring from disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect. They who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. In their gray visions they obtain glimpses of eternity and thrill in awakening to find that they have been upon the verge of the great secret. In snatches they learn something of the wisdom which is of good and more of the mere knowledge which is of evil. They penetrate, however rudderless or compassless, into the vast ocean of the light ineffable, and again, like the adventures of the Nubian geographer, aggressi sunt mare tenebrarum quid deneo esset exploratori. Latin for they face the sea of dangers, wondering only what is contained therein. We will say then that I am mad. I grant, at least, that there are two distinct conditions of my mental existence: the condition of a lucid reason not to be disputed, and belonging to the memory of events forming the first epoch of my life, and a condition of shadow and doubt, appertaining to the present, and to the recollection of what constitutes the second great era of my being. Therefore, what I shall tell of the earlier period, believe, and to what I may relate of the later time, give only such credit as may seem due, or doubt it altogether, or if doubt it ye cannot, then play unto its riddle the Oedipus. She whom I loved in youth, and of whom I now pen calmly and distinctly these remembrances, was the sole daughter of the only sister of my mother long departed. Eleonora was the name of my cousin. We had always dwelled together beneath a tropical sun in the valley of the many-colored grass. No unguided footstep ever came upon that vale, for it lay away up among a range of giant hills that hung beetling about it, shutting out the sunlight from its sweetest recesses. No path was trodden in its vicinity, and, to reach our happy home, there was need of putting back with force the foliage of many thousands of forest trees, and of crushing to death the glories of many millions of fragrant flowers. Thus it was that we all lived alone, knowing nothing of the world without the valley, I and my cousin and her mother. From the dim regions beyond the mountains at the upper end of our encircled domain, there crept out a narrow and deep river, brighter than all save the eyes of Eleonora. And winding stealthily about it in mazy courses, it passed away at length through a shadowy gorge among hills still dimmer than those whence it had issued. We called it the River of Silence, for there seemed to be a hushing influence in its flow. No murmur arose from its bed, and so gently it wandered along that the pearly pebbles upon which we loved to gaze, far down within its bosom, stirred not at all, but lay in a motionless content, each in its old station, shining on gloriously forever. The margin of the river, and of the many dazzling rivulets that glided through devious ways into its channel, as well as the spaces that extended from the margins away down into the depths of the streams until they reached the bed of pebbles at the bottom, these spots, not less than the whole surface of the valley, from the river to the mountains that girdled it in, were carpeted all by a soft green grass, thick, short, perfectly even, and vanilla perfumed, but so besprinkled throughout with the yellow buttercup, the white daisy, the purple violet, and the ruby red asphodel, that its exceeding beauty spoke to our hearts in loud tones of the love and of the glory of God. And here and there, in groves about this grass, like wildernesses of dreams, sprang up fantastic trees, whose tall slender stems stood not upright, but slanted gracefully toward the light that peered at noonday into the center of the valley. Their mark was bespeckled with the vivid alternate splendor of ebony and silver, and was smoother than all save the cheeks of Eleonora, so that, but for the brilliant green of the huge leaves that spread from their summits in long, tremulous lines, dallying with the zephyrs, one might have fancied them giant serpents of Syria doing homage to their sovereign the sun. Hand in hand about this valley for 15 years roamed I with Eleonora before love entered our hearts. It was one evening at the close of the third lustrum of her life and of the fourth of my own, that we sat, locked in each other's embrace beneath the serpent-like trees, and looked down within the water of the river of silence at our images therein. We spoke no words during the rest of that sweet day, and our words even upon the morrow were tremulous and few. We had drawn the god Eros from that wave, and now we felt that he had enkindled within us the fiery souls of our forefathers. The passions which had for centuries distinguished our race came thronging with the fancies for which they had been equally noted, and together breathed the delirious bliss over the valley of the many-colored grass. A change fell upon all things. Strange, brilliant flowers, star-shaped, burn out upon the trees where no flowers had been known before. The tints of the green carpet deepened, and when, one by one, the white daisies shrank away, there sprang up in place of them 10 by 10 of the ruby-red asphodel, and life arose in our paths, for the tall flamingo, hitherto unseen, with all gay, glowing birds, flaunted his scarlet plumage before us. The golden and silver fish haunted the river, out of the bosom of which issued, little by little, a murmur that swelled at length into a lulling melody more divine than that of the harp of Aeolus, sweeter than all save the voice of Eleonora. And now, too, of a luminous cloud, which we had long watched in the regions of Hesper, floated out thence, all glorious in crimson and gold, and settling in peace above us, sank, day by day, lower and lower, until its edges rested upon the tops of the mountains, turning all their dimness into magnificence, and shutting us up, as if forever, within a magic prison house of grandeur and of glory. The loveliness of Eleonora was that of the seraphim, but she was a maiden, artless and innocent as the brief life she had led among the flowers. No guile disguised the fervor of love which animated her heart, and she examined with me its inmost recesses as we walked together in the valley of the many-colored grass, and discoursed of the mighty changes which had lately taken place therein. At length, having spoken one day in tears of the last sad change which must befall humanity, she thenceforward dwelt upon only this one sorrowful theme, interweaving it into all our converse, as, in the songs of the Bard of Shiraz, the same images are found occurring again and again in every impressive variation of phrase. She had seen that the finger of death was upon her bosom, that, like the ephemeron, she had been made perfect in loveliness only to die. But the terrors of the grave to her lay solely in a consideration which she revealed to me one evening at twilight, by the banks of the river of silence. She grieved to think that, having entombed her in the valley of the many-colored grass, I would quit forever its happy recesses, transferring the love which now was so passionately her own to some maiden of the outer and everyday world. And then and there I threw myself hurriedly at the feet of Eleonora and offered up a vow to herself and to heaven that I would never bind myself in marriage to any daughter of earth, that I would in no manner prove recreant to her dear memory, or to the memory of the devout affection with which she had blessed me. And I called the mighty ruler of the universe to witness the pious solemnity of my vow, and the curse which I invoked of him and of her, a saint in illusion, should I prove traitorous to that promise, involved a penalty the exceeding great horror of which will not permit me to make record of it here. And the bright eyes of Eleonora grew brighter at my words, and she sighed as if a deadly burden had been taken from her breast. And she trembled and very bitterly wept. But she made acceptance of the vow, for what was she but a child? And it made easy to her the bed of her death. And she said to me, not many days afterwards, tranquilly dying, that because of what I had done for the comfort of her spirit, she would watch over me in that spirit when departed, and, if it were so permitted, her return to me visibly in the watches of the night. But if this thing were indeed beyond the power of the souls in paradise, that she would at least give me frequent indications of her presence, sighing upon me in the evening winds, or filling the air which I breathed with perfume from the censers of the angels. And with these words upon her lips, she yielded up her innocent life, putting an end to the first epoch of my own. Thus far I have faithfully said, but as I pass the barrier in time's path, formed by the death of my beloved, and proceed with the second era of my existence, I feel that a shadow gathers over my brain, and I mistrust the perfect sanity of the record. But let me on. Years dragged themselves along heavily, and still I dwelled within the valley of the many-colored grass. But a second change had come upon all things. The star-shaped flowers shrank into the stems of the trees and appeared no more. The tints of the green carpet faded, and one by one the ruby-red asphodels withered away, and there sprang up in place of them 10 by 10 dark eye-like violets that writhed uneasily and were ever encumbered with dew. And life departed from our paths, for the tall flamingo flaunted no longer his scarlet plumage before us, but flew sadly from the vale into the hills with all the gay glowing birds that arrived in his company, and the golden and silver fish swam down through the gorge at the lower end of our domain, and bedecked the sweet river never again. And the lulling melody that had been softer than the wind harp of Aeolus, and more divine than all save the voice of Eleonora, it died, little by little away, in murmurs growing lower and lower, until the stream returned at length utterly into the solemnity of its original silence. And then lastly, the voluminous cloud uprose, and, abandoning the tops of the mountains to the dimness of old, fell back into the regions of Hesper and took away all its manifold golden and glorious glories from the valley of the many-colored grass. Yet the promises of Eleonora were not forgotten, for I heard the sounds of the swinging of the censers of the angels, and streams of a holy perfume floated ever and ever about the valley, and, at lone hours, when my heart beat heavily, the winds that bathed my brow came unto me laden with soft sighs, and indistinct murmurs filled often the night air, and once, oh, but once only, I was awakened from a slumber, like the slumber of death, by the pressing of spiritual lips upon my own. But the void within my heart refused even thus to be filled. I longed for the love which had before filled it to overflowing. At length the valley pained me through its memories of Eleonora, and I left it forever for the vanities and the turbulent triumphs of the world. I found myself within a strange city, where all things might have served to blot from recollection the sweet dreams I had dreamed so long in the valley of the many-colored grass, the pomps and pageantries of a stately court, and the mad clangor of arms, and the radiant loveliness of women bewildered and intoxicated my brain. But as yet my soul had proved true to its vows, and the indications of the presence of Eleonora were still given me in the silent hours of the night. Suddenly these manifestations, they ceased, and the world grew dark before mine eyes, and I stood aghast at the burning thoughts which possessed, at the terrible temptations which beset me. For there came from some far, far distant and unknown land, into the gay court of the king I served, a maiden to whose beauty my whole recreant heart yielded at once, at whose footstool I bowed down without a struggle, in the most ardent, in the most abject worship of love. What indeed was my passion for the young girl of the valley in comparison with the fervor and the delirium and the spirit-lifting ecstasy of adoration with which I poured out my whole soul in tears at the feet of the ethereal Ermengarde? Oh, bright was the seraph Ermengarde, and in that knowledge I had room for none other. Oh, divine was the angel Ermengarde, and as I looked down into the depths of her memorial eyes, I thought only of them and of her. I wedded, nor dreaded the curse I had invoked, and its bitterness was not visited upon me, and once, but once again, in the silence of the night, there came through my lattice the soft sighs which had forsaken me, and they modeled themselves into familiar and sweet voice, saying, "Sleep in peace, for the spirit of love reigneth and ruleth, and in taking to thy passionate heart her who is Ermengarde, thou art absolved for reasons which shall be made known to thee in heaven, of thy vows unto Eleonora." The end. Very autobiographical. He struggled in his writing to deal with his penetrating grief. He wrote a poem, Annabel Lee, which is more popular, such as The Raven. Annabel Lee, it was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Edgar was originally buried in 1849 in an unmarked grave. Over the years, the site became overgrown with weeds. Eventually, George W. Spence, the sexton, placed there a small block of sandstone bearing a carved number 80. Reports of Poe's anonymous and unkept grave began to circulate, first privately, then in the newspapers. In 1860, Maria Clem wrote to Nielsen from Alexandria, Virginia, "A lady called on me a short time ago from Baltimore. She said she had visited my darling Eddie's grave. She said it was in the basement of the church, covered with rubbish and coal. Is this true? Please let me know. I'm certain both he and I still have friends left to rescue his loved remains from degradation. This note of concern seems to have spurred Nielsen to action. He appears to have assured Mrs. Clem that Poe was buried in the family lot and that he would take care that the grave was better maintained. Shortly after, he ordered a marble headstone which was in the process of being carved by Hugh Sisson. Due to the weight of the stones and the difficulty of moving them, the monument yard was next to the railroad line. Before it could be installed, the recently completed stone was destroyed in an accident. The train ran off the tracks and directly through the yard. Not being a wealthy man, Nielsen did not order a second stone. All that survives today is a pencil sketch of that original headstone. By 1865, a movement had begun under the leadership of a Miss Sarah Sigourney Rice to provide for a new monument to Baltimore's neglected poet. Through a combination of pennies accumulated by students, gifts from friends, and a variety of benefits, half of the necessary amount was raised by 1871. The remainder was donated by George W. Childs of Philadelphia in 1874. And the monument was designed by an architect, the guy who designed Baltimore City Hall, and only one accident befell this creation. Several possibilities were suggested by the likes of Oliver Wendell Holmes and James R. Lowell. The new monument has no epitaph, only the names and dates of its occupants. So after some discussion on the most appropriate location for this big new imposing edifice, it was decided that it would be best to use the front corner of the cemetery. The church, built around 1855, would have blocked view of the grave from the street if Poe was left in his grandfather's lot. There was also a small problem of securing rights to enough surrounding space. Ultimately, the monument was dedicated on November 17th, 1875. Those who attended were Latrobe, one of the judges who awarded Poe the Baltimore Saturday Visitor Prize in 1833, Judge Nielsen Poe, Edgar's cousin, and Walt Whitman, the great American poet who actually met Poe once. Letters from H.W. Longfellow, John G. Whittier, William C. Bryant, and Alfred Tennyson were read. The remains of Virginia Poe, his beloved wife, buried in 1847 in New York, were actually sitting under a bed in an ossuary. More about that in a moment. But they were brought to Baltimore in 1847. They were added to those of Poe and Maria Clem in 1885. So technically, Virginia's remains were buried next to the monument on the south side. So there was a ceremony, and also present was Sarah Rice, and Virginia's remains were reburied by the same George W. Spence who had buried Poe in 1849, the original burial, and supervised his reburial in 1875. Thus, the three who had struggled together as a family for so many years were reunited for eternity. So, Poe's wife, they moved around a lot. They lived in New York, they lived in Baltimore, they lived in Philadelphia. She had been buried in a cemetery, and that cemetery was being developed. It was in New York, as it happens. They needed the real estate. They were digging up graves and telling family members to come claim the remains of your loved ones. So a biographer of Poe, William Gill, gathered her bones the very day that they took a shovel to her gravesite and dug up her bones. That day, William Gill, a huge Poe fan, gathered those bones and stored them in a box he hid under his bed. So 27 years after the event, it was covered by the Boston Herald, but he came to the Fordham Cemetery in 1883 at exactly the moment that the sexton, Dennis Valentine, held her bones in his shovel, ready to throw them out as unclaimed. So Gill took Virginia's remains, and after corresponding with Nielsen Poe and John Prentice Poe in Baltimore, arranged to bring the box down to be laid on Poe's left side in a small bronze casket. Virginia's remains were finally buried with her husband in 1885. So nearly 10 years after his current monument was erected. And the exhumation and reburials of Poe, I think people might find interesting. He died early on a Sunday morning in 1849, and the next day, which was raw and cold, his body was buried first in an unmarked grave in the family plot, as I mentioned. But they struggled to raise money. They just couldn't do anything about it until they had the money. Again, Edgar Allan Poe never made any real wealth as a writer. But there is this letter. A reporter for the Baltimore American described the exhumation. When Poe was originally buried, they dug him up to move him to a better spot with a better marker. And here's what the letter says. The laborers employed to perform the task, upon digging to a depth of about 5 feet, discovered the coffin in a state of good preservation, after having lain in its place nearly 26 years. The lid was removed, and the remains curiously examined by the few present. There, before their gaze, was extended the skeleton, almost in perfect condition, and lying with the long bony hands reposing one upon the other as they had been arranged in death. The skull bore marks of greater decay, the teeth from the upper jaw having become dislodged, but those in the lower were all in place, and some little hair was still clinging near the forehead. Beyond what has been described, nothing was to be seen. The coffin was enclosed in another and reinterred. So, very few people were there for that. So, again, there was a second exhumation, and that was a different deal. There were more people gathered. That Trump's fame had increased. The people of Baltimore were proud of their dead poet, their dead writer. They loved him as his fame spread throughout the world. So they gathered, and this time, when he was reinterred, they climbed trees to get a view of the reburial. And I personally am about a 90-minute drive. I live about 90 minutes from his burial site, and occasionally I do go there to commune with my dear brother from another mother, touch this beautiful monument, and think of Edgar, who so influenced my writing and my life. His ability to transform, I should say, the most intense grief. But a word about this wife, and anyone who has checked out Poe may be a little bit horrified to know that she was 13 years old and he was 27, and they were first cousins when they married. Now, from people who knew them well, there's a strong theory that the two did not consummate their marriage in the traditional sense until she was slightly older, in her later teens. That, it was not entirely unusual at that time for cousins to marry or for massive age gaps. For example, after the Civil War, young females would marry these grizzled old Civil War veterans to take care of them. It wasn't always sexual in nature, but they would keep the house and do the laundry and such and take care of these old codgers and gently saw them out of this world, and then they would benefit from their, veterans' income that they were receiving as a wife. So there were all sorts of arrangements at the time, but, Poe's love for Virginia was blessed by Virginia's mother, was blessed by the family. And as hopefully you can tell from reading his stories, how much he genuinely loved her, and how he transformed the grief of losing her into the greatest writing I have ever experienced. I just wish people would put down that cringe factor and get to know Edgar Allan Poe, research his life, but more, read his work. It is unparalleled. I challenge. The writers of the day were envious of him. Some had more money coming in, some had more fame, better known, but all around the world, his contemporaries all envied him. And this is why the average reader should explore Poe. You don't have to be a horror fan. You just have to be a fan of literature and read it and let it wash over you. Now that you know a little bit more about this beloved wife, read The Raven. The Raven poem, which many of us had to memorize in school. I still remember it, 5,000 words, word for word. I can recite it right now, but you can look that up as well. All of these beautiful works of art that just last forever, for eternity, were inspired by his love for Virginia Clem. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening, and I wish you all the best, and we'll see you on the Speculative podcast soon enough.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.